Hello and welcome back to Fixing Fallout 3. It's been a while since my last upload in the series. Sorry about that. But if you're new here, be sure to go back and check out the first 4 episodes to catch up with the story so far. Quick recap, we're taking the vanilla story of Fallout 3 and making some tactical rewrites to improve the world building and the flow of the plot. We left off with the player completing their first excursions into downtown DC. After helping Riley's Rangers bounce back from the brink of destruction, they finally receive some critical information from Three Dog, pointing them towards a group of people who might know more about your enigmatic father and his abrupt disappearance some 20 years ago. Remember, in this version of the story, your character grew up as an orphan in the Vault. Following the destruction of Vault 101 by a mysterious paramilitary force known as the Enclave, you've been searching for this man, following the last cryptic instructions of the Overseer. You believe that somehow your father might have the answers to why Vault 101 was raided, who the Enclave are, and what their ultimate plan for the capital Wasteland might be. In the last episode, you finally found someone with some answers. Turns out the radio DJ Three Dog was once part of a mercenary group, hired by your father to help him complete some sort of job to the far north of the capital Wasteland. Three Dog never made it all the way, but there's a whole group of people out there who might have made it further, and they might have learned what the true purpose of the expedition was along the way. Closest to Three Dog is Madison Lee, who you're probably familiar with, as she already plays a big part in the main quest of Fallout 3. In our rewrite, though, you won't find her at Rivet City, but heading up the still-active Project Purity installation on Jefferson Island. I'm making this change for 2 reasons. Firstly, we replaced the Brotherhood of Steel's presence in downtown DC with Riley's Rangers, so we haven't actually given the player a formal introduction to the Brotherhood yet. And secondly, a lot of crucial plot information is communicated during the player's first visit to Project Purity through holotapes. Yeah, BGS quest design really hasn't changed much throughout the years, has it? Well, I'm sure that we're all pretty familiar with one of the golden rules of storytelling. That being, if you want to communicate the importance of a plot beat to your audience, show them, don't tell them why it's important. But BGS seems to have gotten that one a little bass-ackwards. Bearing all this crucial information for the story behind optional hidden pickups just makes it feel like plot is an afterthought. And while Project Purity is a fairly interesting set-piece location, the player's first visit here is pretty dry, with only a few laser turrets and super mutants to fight. But by making this location home to an active restoration project by the time the player arrives, it will make a more lasting impression and better communicate that this place will eventually become extremely important throughout the course of the story. But of course, when the player comes knocking on the front door, the Brotherhood isn't just going to let them in, right? At this point, they probably haven't done anything yet to put themselves on the Brotherhood's radar, for good or ill. So the player won't just be given access to speak to the head of the project. Probably have to complete some stupid fetch quest for the Brotherhood first before they can earn their trust. Only, the Brotherhood isn't on their last legs like the Rangers were. And what could they possibly need from some random mercenary? Any resources that Dr. Lee needs, she has an entire army at her disposal to get it for her. And with all the firepower that the Brotherhood has at their disposal, the player won't be shooting their way in either. So while Dr. Lee might at first seem like the obvious choice to go to for information, the player will be initially barred from this path as there's simply nothing that the Brotherhood needs from them right now. This totally subverts the quid pro quo quest design, which we've relied on heavily for the story so far. And like the player's experience with Moriarty, it should be another more explicit lesson to the player that not everyone is interested in helping you achieve your goals. So when meeting the Brotherhood for the first time, I think it would be cool if we could include a callback to Fallout 1, where, to earn their trust, the player is sent on an obvious suicide mission to recover some useless piece of technology from a forgotten corner of the Wasteland. In Fallout 1, this involved retrieving a Brotherhood holodisk from a destroyed West Tech Research Center, which becomes important to the main plot, as this facility was where the FEV virus was originally created. And you can probably already guess that the Fallout 3 equivalent of this MacGuffin is the GEC, which we won't learn for a while yet, but it's actually what Dr. Lee needs to get the project up and running. So when the player waltzes on up to the Brotherhood, asks them if they have any work available, and are given this impossible task, the Brotherhood is basically telling them to get lost. Now, maybe the player has already visited the Vault Tech HQ downtown. They might have already downloaded the map of all the other vaults in the capital Wasteland. They might have even dived into the files and learned that Vault 87 is the only one nearby with an operational GEC. This information is all buried in optional terminal files, though, with no quest objective guiding the player towards it, and I would keep it that way. A sneaky, secret way to bypass a significant portion of this open-ended quest line, by skipping most of the legwork needed to gain an audience with Dr. Lee. I won't actually be getting to Vault 87 for a few episodes yet, as the average player will still have to jump through plenty of hoops to reach this stage, but if a returning player already knows where to get the GEC, or an inquisitive player has already put the pieces together and knows where a GEC is located, they can just head there now like an absolute mad lad, and get it early. Assuming, of course, that their underleveled character isn't immediately annihilated by many of the high-level super mutants found there. So, for the moment, the player is struck out trying to get any information from Dr. Lee, leaving them the option of trying their luck with one of our many other red herrings scattered throughout the Wasteland. We've already met Moriarty and Tenpenny in this series during the Power of the Atom side quest, which we pretty much folded into the main quest for most new players. And neither were really willing to give you much information. They strung you along for as much as you were worth, and then pointed you towards Three Dog when they were done with you. Well, as we'll find out from the others, they both played a pretty ancillary role in the expedition. Tenpenny provided the funding, and Moriarty served as logistics coordinator, but neither actually set out with the rest of the mercenaries. So that just leaves the three other surviving members of the expedition that Three Dog knew of. Dukov is a minor character who plays a part in the vanilla side quest You Gotta Shoot Him in the Head, which I've basically integrated in the main story for this portion of our rewrite. But instead of finding him in some random ruin in DC, I'll move him to the raider settlement of Evergreen Mills. In the base game, this is just another raider dungeon like any other. But this was originally meant to be a settlement with NPCs and side quests that the player could interact with. I will restore these features in our rewrite to help flesh out the world building and give the player an evil-aligned settlement to interact with. Evergreen Mills would function as a satellite of Paradise Falls, a base to collect slaves and loot on the south side of the Potomac, for the much larger settlement that Eulogy Jones is building to the north. We ran into some of these raiders way back in episode 1, shortly after escaping the vault. Now, I haven't really mentioned any sort of faction mechanics for the rewrite, and I could be lazy and just copy New Vegas's, but that would be a little anachronistic, and I'm trying to keep the rewrite grounded as a simple rearrangement of Bethesda's own ideas and content for Fallout 3. So, if the player ended up killing the Springville Raiders, they won't be permanently alienated from this faction. I mean, think about it. If the player wipes out an entire outpost, there would be no survivors to report about their actions. But in New Vegas, one shootout is enough to magically make an entire faction hostile to you on sight, even if there was no realistic way for anyone to know about their actions. I think this is actually a huge flaw with New Vegas' RPG mechanics. A huge step up from Bethesda's Fallout, no doubt, but not the greatest system overall. I'll have a lot more to say when I eventually get to talking about New Vegas and how that isn't a perfect game, somewhere down the line. But for now, let's just say that the player won't be excluded from Evergreen Mills if they were previously hostile to the Raiders. But if they help the Raiders, they might have had a good word put in for them, and they'll have an easier time entering the settlement without paying a toll, and better bartering prices at vendors. So inside, you'll find Dukov and probably a bunch of other minor characters that you can take side quests from. Importantly though, you'll be able to get Dukov's side of the story. He might try to string you along like Moriarty did, and hopefully that experience taught you not to take a scumbag's word at face value. So after you beat the information out of him, or get him liquored up enough to talk, he'll end up telling a version of the story pretty similar to Three Dog's rendition. He doesn't know who your father was, or what his ultimate goal was either. This was just a job for these mercenaries, and he reiterates that Dr. Lee is probably the only one who might know more. But he made it farther than she did, though. only turning back after being heavily injured himself during an attack by a pack of Deathclaws. So following up on this lead hasn't really brought you any new information. Except, Dukov might mention a new lead which wasn't so obvious when you spoke to Three Dog earlier. You see, the surviving members of this expedition had to drag themselves back to civilization and get themselves patched up. Well, you might notice that both Three Dog and Dukov have mentioned a certain Doc Church in Megaton, who patched up their injuries. Following this line of inquiry, you might learn that Moriarty's saloon was the rendezvous point if the members of the group ever got separated and had to abandon the mission. Now, obviously, the group never reconvened for any sort of debrief. Dukov skipped town almost immediately, and Three Dog waited with Dr. Lee for months before concluding that your father probably wasn't coming back. Now, this isn't news if you took every last dialogue option when you last spoke to Three Dog. But the mention of one random doctor, now from two different leads, might give you the idea of following up with him in Megaton. But let's say you went north instead, to the Republic of Dave. You'll essentially get the same lead there. Only Dave never returned to Megaton. After the locals saw the group successfully fend off the pack of Deathclaws, Dave was able to pass it off as his accomplishment, fooling the locals by claiming to be an expert at dealing with this invasive species. Staying in the town, he was eventually able to con his way into being their leader, leading to the establishment of the now infamous Republic of Dave. This little side quest shouldn't be that much different than it is in the base game. Only there should be plenty more NPCs here that aren't just Dave's extended family, to give the impression that this is actually a viable community, only one that's perpetually under siege by roving gangs of Deathclaws. We'll return to this area of the map and discover how Enclave experimentation introduced Deathclaws to this area of the Wasteland in a later episode of this series. For now, though, let's say that the player getting here will require a beeline through some very dangerous areas of the map. So chasing these two dead ends should make it clear that Doc Church is the only lead left for the player to pursue, unless they have a spare Gek handy. Returning to Megaton and confronting the good doctor, you might start acting pretty suspicious when you ask about the ill-fated expedition, immediately tipping us off that this guy certainly knows more than he's letting on. Now, if you recall from the base game, Doc Church's is one of the many locations where the player can find a holodisk, which begins the side quest The Replicated Man. And now you can probably see where I'm going with this. You gotta shoot him in the head form the basis for this last stretch of rewrite, and the Replicated Man will form the basis for this next portion. So after pressing Doc Church about the hidden tape, or intimidating him into giving it to you in the first place, you'll start being pointed towards the last member of the expedition that you haven't tracked down yet. At first, this might have seemed like a pretty minor detail. Three Dog never even learned the man's name, and neither did Dukov or Dave. But as you will have learned from them by now, this unnamed fifth member of the expedition was the only one to actually stick it out and follow your father all the way up into the mountains. Assumed dead and written off as a potential lead thus far. But according to Doc Church, the very same man came shambling back into Megaton months after Dukov and Three Dog, heavily injured in a way that the doctor can't even describe. He did what he could to get the man back on his feet and pointed him in the direction of Rivet City, the only place in the Wasteland where he could get treatment for his more peculiar ailments. The only remnant of this enigmatic visitor, a grainy photo buried deep in the files on the doctor's terminal. But at least the player now has a tangible lead towards their next objective. But what if the player doesn't have the muscle or the moxie to make Doc Church fess up? What if they never go exploring in his shack and they don't find that hidden holodisk? What if they sided with Tenpenny during the power of the atom and Megaton is a smoldering ruin? Well, we'll include a contingency for those options because at this point, we're done leading the player down a bunch of loose ends. It's high time we start weaving this story back together again. Now, if Megaton is a ruin, the player's earlier actions have certainly sabotaged themselves. And hey, that's okay. It's okay to let a player shoot themselves in the foot every so often. It might even be fun. One of the key game design philosophies I've been trying to communicate through the karma system is that taking the high road should normally be harder than taking a neutral or a bad karma path. player wants to play the game without breaking any rules or cutting any corners, we should naturally demand higher engagement, as these are the players most likely to actually want to engage in side content and meet the game on its own terms. This might even give them something of a sense of pride and accomplishment, so that they feel like they've earned a good reputation by putting the work in. But we have a golden opportunity to subvert this rule here, and punish the player for being cartoonishly malicious in their past choices. So in that case, to track down this lead, the player will have to gather plenty of Rad-X and some radiation equipment. Not cheap stuff in Joe Biden's economy, because they'll have to go spelunking in the Megaton crater for their information. This might even be a pretty cool set piece, exploring a familiar location atomized by the player's actions, now filled with a bunch of pissed-off fair ghouls. In retrospect, it honestly feels like a bit of a missed opportunity that this wasn't already in the game. And while it might seem a little contrived that of the few things that survived the blast, a safe containing a holotape crucial to advancing the main story would be one of them, yeah, that's absolutely true, but the alternative would be allowing the player to softlock themselves, forcing them to reload a much earlier save, or maybe even restart with a new character. This might be fun for some masochists, but I get the feeling that this wouldn't exactly fly for the majority of players. So we're sort of forced to be a little contrived in this situation. So when the player exits the clinic, with or without prying any information out of Doc Church, they'll be approached by a mysterious armed figure who asks that they politely come with them to discuss a business proposition of sorts. Following them to a nondescript apartment, they'll be greeted by a familiar face. This will be the player's second encounter with Mr. Burke, who we haven't seen since he disappeared, back during the Power of the Atom quest, attempting to convince Confessor Cromwell to deliberately set off the bomb buried in the center of Megaton. Since then, he's basically been public enemy number one, hence the reason for secrecy. Now, if you haven't completed the Power of the Atom, or if Megaton was destroyed, then this sequence might play out a little bit differently, or you might not meet him at all until a later stage in this quest. But assuming that the player doesn't immediately cap the bastard on sight, we'll actually be able to find out a lot more about his motivations in the capital Wasteland. You see, I'll actually be combining this character with that of Mr. Zimmer, the Institute scientist in Rivet City in the base game, who gives you the quest to search for A321, if you didn't find any of the optional holotapes scattered across the Wasteland. In our rewrite, Burke is an agent of the Institute, and so is his hired muscle who brought you here. They're tracking a runaway synth, also the fifth member of the expedition that you're searching for. But the trail went cold in Megaton, after he got facial reconstructive surgery and disappeared somewhere in the capital Wasteland. You're probably already familiar with all this if you've completed the Replicated Man during one of your playthroughs. So you'll also remember that A321 is a courser, a special kind of synthetic dedicated to recapturing runaways, which makes him much more difficult to reacquire because he's already familiar with the Institute's tracking methods. But why was Burke trying to destroy Megaton? And why is the Institute so concerned with recapturing a synth that's been on the run for almost 2 decades? Well, as we'll find out, Burke believes that many other synths have followed A321's path into hiding, leading to the growth of a significant community of synthetic refugees in the capital Wasteland. If they find him, they potentially flush dozens more out of hiding. And crucially, A321 was built much stronger than a standard model. If he were to begin actively working against the Institute's interests, it could pose a significant threat to their field operations. But why destroy Megaton? Well, it was a bit of a last-ditch effort on Burke's part. If A321 was still living there, the blast would significantly damage him, burning away most of his synthetic skin without destroying him, instantly outing him as their target. But even if he wasn't, the destruction of the town would send a clear signal that the Institute was on his tail, potentially flushing him out of hiding anyway. This plan might seem a little far-fetched, and it is, as Burke will admit. But remember, destroying Megaton was mostly Tenpenny's plan anyway, who was unknowingly supporting Burke and thus the Institute's efforts in the capital Wasteland. Burke just happened to be his agent in the scheme, and their motivations just happened to coincide for the moment. So as we begin to peel back the mystery of this character, we should also preserve a sense of threat. In our rewrite, Burke's plan isn't just the punchline to a joke. It's a demonstration of how far the Institute will go to achieve its goals. An entire city full of innocent people are readily sacrificed by this mysterious group, for even the slimmest chance of a return of their errant property. So yeah, as much as this quest was a tease for Fallout 4 and Fallout 3, my rendition of this quest is a tease of my rewrite of the Institute, coming sometime in the 2030s at this point, honestly. But from this point on, the quest continues close to how it does in the base game. Burke hires the player to find the runaway android, meaning that they'll have to make their way to Rivet City. Of course, the player doesn't have to agree to help him. But as you can probably tell, the Institute aren't ones to be crossed lightly. And as Burke will mention, he has other assets at play, scouring the Wasteland for A321. So better play nice, for now. Now, if you'll recall, way back in my second video, discussing the changes I would make to the world map, I actually expanded it eastward to include the coastline of Maryland, which is where I would locate Rivet City in our rendition of the game. Yes, I know it's technically possible for an aircraft carrier to sail up Potomac River and more outside of DC. It has happened before. So, point to Bethesda, this piece of world building isn't actually as bizarre as it would initially seem. But I made this change because there isn't really much going on the east side of Fallout 3's map anyway. There's no reason to come this way while you're following the main story, or really at all, unless you're going to Canterbury Commons for that goofy side quest. I also think that some biome diversity would make for some much needed change of scenery. So, following the highway to the coast, the player would come across the ruins of Annapolis, and the derelict aircraft carrier moored in its harbor. This is Rivet City, the largest post-nuclear settlement on this portion of the eastern seaboard, and it's under siege. This is where we'll run into our old friends, Talon Company. Not only have they taken control of all the access points in and out of the DC ruins, they've also seemingly been hired to find some kind of high-value target sheltering in Rivet City. Now, the player probably won't be breaking the siege and fighting their way into the city here, because this group is even larger than the one you've encountered blocking the way into DC way back when. So, speaking of the commander, you'll find out that none other than Talon Company itself are those other assets in play, which Burke told you about. Turns out that they were hired to help track down the android too, and their search has led them to Rivet City. But Talon Company aren't exactly the subtle sort, and Rivet City isn't about to open their gates and let a bunch of up-jump raiders ransack the place. So, keeping in the theme of forcing the player to play ball with a faction before they ultimately decide to help or oppose them, they'll now be working on the side of Talon Company. But let's say the player joined up with them earlier, because that's totally been an option this entire time. Like Riley's Rangers, I've promoted Talon Company to be one of the 4 main factions in the game, and they'll end up playing a major role in the story going forward. As early on in the game as emerging from Vault 101, the player could have traveled south to their Air Force base and joined up with them. This questline would start very innocuously, almost like side content at first. The player would start by proving themselves with some initiate-level odd jobs, as they rise through the ranks of Talon Company's rigid military structure. At some point, though, the player would have been made aware of the Institute contract, and thus, they would have been able to skip earlier portions of the replicated man. But this route would ultimately lead the player to the same place anyway. With a stalemate outside of Rivet City, it'll be up to the player to work as a double agent, entering the city after Talon Company feigns retreat, and the gates are open once again. Of course, the player never has to actually follow through with Talon Company if they aren't already working with them. It's just easiest to talk your way into Rivet City this way. And Rivet City should be a true city. There should be hundreds of NPCs here. Most just normal people going about their lives and having no interactions with the player whatsoever. Just enough to give the impression that this is a city of thousands of people. A US carrier bunks up to 6,500 people, and Rivet City is much more densely populated. Many of the hangars have been cleared of equipment and are home to dense shanty towns, while the flat upper deck is a city of its own, where the wealthier residents live in the open air and sunlight. But there's still plenty of deactivated military equipment scattered throughout the bowels of the Metal Colossus, and plenty more at the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. Turns out, during the Great War, Annapolis was hosting a massive naval flotilla to christen the unveiling of the nearby Anchorage War Memorial. Most ships were destroyed in the initial blasts, while others eventually rotted away. USS Anchorage, Pride of the Fleet, is the only vessel left afloat, and now home to Rivet City. So the Chesapeake is a naval graveyard, and this actually plays a fairly important role in current city politics. You see, while the city does have a fairly advanced hydroponics lab running off pre-war technology, that's not nearly enough to feed the city's thousands of residents. Plus, the boat is mostly housing space, with very little opportunity for domestic manufacturing centers, meaning that they have to trade with outsiders for most of the resources needed to support such a large population. They do this by sending out dive teams to scavenge from the naval wrecks at the bottom of the bay. They have to wear specialized dive suits to protect themselves against the highly radioactive ocean water, and they wage an endless war in the depths against hordes of mirelurks, who, for reasons unknown, also covet the wrecks, although probably just as nesting grounds. This faction of professional divers and scavengers make up a pretty significant force in local politics, as they essentially control the city's income. At the same time, the ambitious leaders of the city council have begun advocating for a restoration of the vessel's defenses and engines, so that the USS Anchorage can function as a ship again. They say that while the spoils from the Chesapeake flotilla won't be depleted for decades yet, it would still be good practice to use some of the recovered technology to make Rivet City seaworthy in the meantime, able to migrate up and down the eastern seaboard as a mobile trading center. But the Divers Union basically has a hard veto on all city politics because of their importance, and obviously they oppose a restoration, as it will eliminate the city's dependence on them. Plus, they argue that if Rivet City sails off into unknown waters, it might be destroyed, commandeered by a larger faction, or they might even be reduced to piracy if trade isn't as lucrative as it is in the capital Wasteland. So, as usual, the players just stumbled into the heart of a contrived political mess, and they'll be left with the option of untangling it, or heading straight towards their objective. And where's our boy in all this mess? Well, I actually think it's fairly clever that Harkness is the first NPC we interact with when entering the city, even if the player hasn't begun the quest yet. It makes sure that he's at least somewhat familiar when we ultimately learn his true identity. So we can keep this, and just like in Fallout 3, if the player collected all of his holotapes scattered across the wasteland, we can immediately deduce his identity. But that doesn't mean he'll believe us. Without his recall codes, he doesn't even remember that he's a synth. Assuming that we do confront him, there's no way that we'll be able to get him to trust us enough to follow us anywhere. So either way, the player will end up searching for Pinkerton, one of the enigmatic founders of the city, and the surgeon who presumably helped A321 disguise himself. Originally, this involved exploring the derelict section of the aircraft carrier. But with the boat in one piece in our rewrite, this will involve suiting up with the divers for an underwater combat section that sees the player exploring the naval graveyard. Eventually, we'll find a beach submarine that's inhabited, used by Pinkerton as a hidden base to study the mirelurks. For the rewrite, let's say that Pinkerton was actually an ex-Institute scientist, which would explain his capacity to help repair and reprogram escaped synths. We might learn a bit more about this enigmatic faction from him, as Burke hasn't really provided us with an unbiased explanation of his employers yet. Pinkerton is old school, back from when the Institute was less KGB and more MIT. He was one of their field agents, a biologist stationed here to study the mirelurk population, and the possibility that they might be forming an intelligent society. But in our Fallout universe, as the Institute went bad, not only did they get into the business of mass-producing synthetic humanoids, they've also begun using these operatives as infiltrators to destabilize different ascendant factions throughout the Wasteland. Talent Company being secretly controlled by an outside force is something that's actually sort of hinted at in-game, as the terminal entry states that they were hired by a mysterious wealthy benefactor to keep the capital Wasteland lawless and disunited. Consider also that Riley's Rangers were contracted by another mysterious outside influence to chart the DC ruins. So yeah, the idea that I'm toying at here is that the Institute secretly controls various Wasteland factions, and is puppeteering them against each other to keep the Wasteland weak and disunited. This would certainly be a major rug pull, something not entirely obvious at first glance, but clear to dedicated fans who go scanning through terminals, reading every obscure text entry. It's also something that will have major implications for the series going forward. And of course, something that will come up again when I eventually get around to rewriting Fallout 4. So, as a side effect of Pinkerton's research activity was the growth of Rivet City, one of those same ascendant factions which the Institute now seeks to control. So, in this rendition, instead of self-exile after a corporate spat with Dr. Lee, Pinkerton saw the writing on the wall. He killed the synth that the Institute sent to replace him, thus faking his death and beating feet to his new hideout, living out the rest of his days in paranoid seclusion. He's not exactly the altruistic sort, but he is the stereotypical, obsessive, mad scientist sort. So when Harkness found him, he just couldn't pass up the opportunity to work on an advanced prototype again, and to stick it to his former employers. This has led to the growth of a substantial community of synth expats, following Harkness's footsteps and using Pinkerton to disguise themselves, settling in Rivet City after receiving the facial treatment. Like in the base game, Pinkerton will give you Harkness if you leave him in peace. But you can also inform on him to Burke, or kill him yourself for a substantial bonus. Returning to Rivet City, the jig is up. With decent enough karma, you might have already been approached by the railroad and begged to give up the search. Combined with a decent enough speech skill, you might have even convinced them to lead you to Harkness and skip Pinkerton entirely. Or with bad karma, you might have already been attacked by one of their agents during your search in the city. And if you weren't able to convince them that you're trustworthy enough, returning to the city, you'll find it in the midst of a terrorist incident. The railroad knows that Pinkerton has been compromised, and they're preparing to evacuate all the synths from the city by vertibird. They've taken several hostages, and they control the tower as they wait for an aerial evac. They've also activated the recall codes on all the synths in the city, including Harkness, giving them a small army to hold off the security forces. This will set up the theme of the railroad being a little too extreme in their radical abolitionism, as they value the well-being of synths and opposition to the Institute higher than the lives of any human bystanders. And as bad as the Institute are, this tells us that the railroad aren't angels themselves. But for now, this will be a major tease that this faction actually has some bite behind it, enough to oppose an omnipotent force like the Institute. And they're more than willing to put innocents in danger if it means accomplishing their goals. So here, the player will either have to fight their way through the synths, or try and negotiate with them. Again though, if the player isn't able to convince them of their trustworthiness and gain a chance to speak to Harkness, they can't let them leave. The regular synths aren't much different than an average human enemy, but Harkness is basically a Terminator, making him a mini-boss which the player will have to fight their way through. Alternatively, with a high enough tech skill, they can use a set of recall codes found on Pinkerton's terminal to flip him against the railroad and watch the fireworks ensue, putting an end to the railroad's presence in Rivet City. After the battle, you'll have to quickly wring some information out of a dying Harkness, much less than you would have gotten if you had left him in one piece. It will also piss off Burke, as he wanted the return of Institute property, not its destruction. But hold on. What if the player gained the railroad's trust? Or what if they recognized Harkness immediately when they entered the city, and activated his recall codes with the railroad's blessing? In that case, they'll have to help Harkness throw off the Institute's tail. Something that isn't just as simple as gunning down Mr. Burke and his hired thugs. Instead, this will involve misdirecting Burke towards a random location, something like the Anchorage War Memorial, where the player and a railroad strike group will ambush him. This will be a tough fight. You'll be fighting another Institute cursor, and Burke will call in reinforcements to take you out. You probably won't be able to kill Burke. He'll just teleport away before you can reach him. But it will shake the Institute for a time. The synth community in Rivet City will still have to be evacuated, but slowly and in secret, without putting innocents in the crossfire. The player might even end up with Harkness as a new companion. Who knows? I always thought it was weird that he wasn't one. But what if the player managed to lead Harkness out of the city? Or what if they used his command codes to flip him against the Institute? Well, this outcome might be the most interesting lore-wise. After Harkness is returned to Burke, we'll set him up as our G-Man, so to speak. A major tease for the possibilities of the Fallout franchise in the future. He'll congratulate you on your efforts and lavishly reward you, but also give you the option of engaging in more radiant bounty quests to hunt down other escaped synths throughout the Wasteland, This is the ultimate sequel tease, as the reward for each capture will be more advanced Institute armor and weaponry. And at the end of the game, an invitation to join the Institute itself. But enough sequel bait for now. We're finally here. We've jumped through enough hoops and enough script to get here. What does our boy have to say? Well, turns out it's all been worth it, as Harkness was the final lead we needed to help track down our father. A321 was the only one to actually make it, with your dad, to the destination of the expedition, and possibly the last person in the Wasteland to see him alive. Raven Rock, a pre-war military base nestled high in the Appalachian Mountains, was abandoned when they found it. The only inhabitant, a rogue AI, which spoke to your father and apparently spooked him so badly that he immediately tried to deactivate it. But the AI had hundreds of backup servers, and the ability to snake its way through the dormant servers of pre-war military bases at will. The AI, somehow already aware that Harkness was himself an android, activated his command codes and set the two against each other, while activating the facility's self-destruct function. After a brutal fight, your father was able to narrowly escape the facility with a deactivated Harkness in tow. Limping back to civilization, he was able to break his programming and reactivate him, sending him on his way to Megaton, but leaving him with the damage that necessitated reconstructive surgery. Your father didn't even stop to regroup in Megaton. Whatever force he confronted up there in the mountains, it scared him so badly that he immediately set out towards the only thing he thought might be able to stop it. Whatever this was, he thought it was located in Vault 112, far to the east. So finally, you know where your father disappeared off to, all those years ago. The main story is condensed back towards one single lead again, and I think you can all tell where we're going with this. In the next episode, we're headed to Tranquility Lane, probably the best set piece in Fallout 3's campaign, where we'll finally meet Dad in the flesh, and we'll get some much-needed answers about what this mysterious new threat to the Wasteland actually is. Unfortunately, though, we'll have to leave that adventure for next time. This has already ended up being the longest video in this series so far. And if you can believe it, I've actually had this whole story planned out since I launched this channel, way back in 2021. But getting that rough outline scripted, recorded, filmed, and edited is a lot harder than it sounds. And I've been sidetracked plenty of times along the way. But I mean to finish it soon. It may not sound like it, but we're in the closing stretch now, and I won't rest until this series is done. So thank you so much to the people tuning in and leaving words of encouragement. These videos don't get many views, and I wouldn't have the motivation to keep going without knowing that someone, somewhere, appreciated what I'm doing. I will finish this thing, no matter how long it takes. So in the meantime, be sure to check out some of my live streams or some of my shorter commentary videos, and subscribe to the channel to help boost the reach of these videos. Adios for now, you beautiful people, and stay tuned.